Alright, so welcome to World War II Part 10. We've been talking about the war in the Pacific. The United States has been island hopping with the Navy and the Marines making their way closer and closer to mainland Japan, and they are there. It's 1945. Guam, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, Philippines, they've all been taken over. Now the question is, how are we going to try to finish this portion, this theater of the war off? All right, so there's a lot of questions about how hard it would be to actually fight on mainland Japan, but we've got a little ace in the hole. Those are the atomic bombs. Since 1942, the United States has been working on the top secret Manhattan Project. The Manhattan Project is the name of the project to develop the nuclear weapons, the A-bombs as they called them at the time, because they split an atom. And then they unleash more power than the world had ever seen. Eventually they'll have hydrogen bombs, and now we have bombs bigger than both of those. But since 1942, the top secret Manhattan Project, under the leadership of Robert Oppenheimer, has been working to develop the atomic bombs. It's July 16th of 1945 that we have the first successful detonation and test of an atomic bomb in the desert of New Mexico. Now, when Truman finds out about that, he now understands that he has a new weapon, the likes of which the world has never seen, and that honestly people couldn't even comprehend. Truman found out about the successful test while he was at the Potsdam Conference with Churchill and Stalin, and all of a sudden Truman got real cocky. He understood the power because he had been talking to the scientists and he had been talking to his military advisors, and he understood that this was a weapon like the world had never seen. So all of a sudden, like, him and Stalin had been bickering a little bit at the Potsdam Conference, and he just really started to take control and take a more stern line with the Soviet Union and Stalin, because he understood now the United States was going to be the #1 world superpower, because no one else had this weapon, and no one else is going to come out of the war as untouched and unscathed as the United States. But now we need to make the decision of how are we going to use these, and actually are we going to use these? So as we just get ready to talk about that, the United States has been going through this grueling process of starting out from Pearl Harbor, fighting battles in Midway, fighting battles at the Coral Sea and Guadalcanal, Guam, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, before that the Philippines. So there's been all of these battles, and the United States have been slowly working their way towards Japan. And we talked in the last video about how difficult and dangerous this fighting was. It was some of the most intense fighting that the world has ever seen. The Japanese were fierce soldiers, feared soldiers, willing to fight and die for the country to the last man. So there's a lot of questions here. Okay, as we're getting to the door of Japan, we have these nuclear weapons. What are we going to do? All right. First thing is, how are we going to use them? Are we going to use them? Truman was really determined to use them one way or the other because he wanted to show the world who was going to be in charge after World War II. It wasn't going to be the Soviet Union and Stalin. It was going to be the United States and the presidents thereof. So he definitely wanted to use them. So now we know we have two weapons. How are we going to use them? One thought was, what we could do is we could do like a test detonation. We could say, okay, Japan, we want you to look at this uninhabited island or this stretch of ocean at this day, at this time, and we detonate one. We say, if you don't surrender, this is coming your way. But a lot of people thought, no, you wouldn't really understand the destruction even by seeing a test. Like Churchill and Stalin had heard that the United States had this A-bomb, and they both, like Churchill's quoted saying something like, it's just a bigger bang. No one quite understood the destructive power that this thing had, and you kind of had to almost see it on land and see it just vaporize things to really understand how powerful it was. They said, no, test isn't going to work. Some people thought, hey, even if we drop these things, is that going to convince the Japanese to surrender, right? I mean, they're willing to, fly their planes into the sides of ships in these kamikaze attacks. Maybe this isn't even going to be enough. So is the loss of life worth it? Because we know it's going to be a lot of civilian life. Is that loss of civilian life worth it? Even if they're not going to surrender? And, people start saying, oh, no, we probably need to drop it. But what ultimately pushes Truman and his military advisors and his cabinet to say, yeah, we're going to do this, are honestly two things. One was the price tag. The Manhattan Project had racked up $2 billion of debt from 1942 to 1945. And a lot of people said, listen, the American public are going to be upset if we spent all this money and never used it. The bigger factor that pushed Truman to eventually say, yes, we have to use the atomic bomb, were the projections of the loss of life for a mainland invasion of Japan. The conservative estimate was that 2 million American soldiers were going to die with a mainland invasion of Japan. That's not taken into account. That number of 2 million, that's just American soldiers. That's not Japanese soldiers and Japanese civilians that would be caught in the fire of the battle and die as collateral damage. So eventually Truman had to do some very difficult, very crude math and say, you know what? We're actually going to save more lives by dropping these 2 atomic bombs. So eventually the decision is made. Now there's a whole committee that is created for, okay, now where are we going to drop these atomic bombs? The decision was made, we're going to attack cities in the early going that were relatively small and had military infrastructure. So Nagasaki and Hiroshima both had military industrial plants where they were making things to help, fight the war for Japan. So we make the decision that Hiroshima will be first. Now, Truman did actually send a message. Oh, yeah, and Truman's in charge now. I'll talk about this a little bit tomorrow. FDR died in 1944. Sorry, I should have said that earlier. Okay, so Truman's in charge. He sends a message to Japan. He says, you need to surrender or, quote, face utter destruction. And of course the Japanese say, well, we don't know what that means. No, we're not going to surrender. We're ready to fight. You haven't even touched foot on Japanese soil yet. And on August 6th of 1945, a plane called the Enola Gay dropped a bomb called Little Boy. That's the name of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. Now the plane was high enough and it takes long enough for the bomb to drop. Everyone in the plane was fine. They were able to get out of there. But as the plane drops and detonates over Hiroshima, in an instant, I mean in 1 second, in the snap of your fingers, bang, in the flash of the bomb, in 1 instant, in the snap of your fingers, 80,000 people die. And they vanish. Like, they are disintegrated. They turn into particles because of this blast. This blast of splitting one atom, one thing that is so small you can't even see it. One atom is split in half, and 80,000 people instantaneously vanish from the face of the earth like they were never here. They just particleize. All right? I mean, look up nuclear shadows. I don't have any pictures in this presentation. Look up nuclear shadow, Nagasaki, Hiroshima, and you'll see some crazy stuff. I mean, you can watch YouTube videos too of what these blasts look like. Even the YouTube videos, though, don't do it justice to be able to really understand it. Like, you can kind of understand it, but you can't. But the first one drops, 80,000 killed instantly in 1 second. In the first second of the flash, 80,000 killed. Thousands more will die from the fires that started, from the burns they got, from the blast, from the radiation, from the cancers caused from the radiation. Thousands more will die. So we dropped the bomb on Hiroshima. I'll bring this to the front. Here's a little before and after. Okay, so on the left, you can see what Hiroshima looked like before. All right, and then you can see what it looks like after. That's a 2.5 mile blast radius. Just gone. Just everything's gone. Like, the buildings are rubble or they just vanish because these bombs are so powerful. All right, so you say, all right, you've seen what we can do. Surrender. Honestly, the civil leaders, the civilian leaders, and even Emperor Hirohito said, let's throw in the towel. The military leaders refused. So 3 days later, on August 9th, Truman said, all right, well, if you're not going to surrender, then here comes another weapon. So this time it was Nagasaki, again, a relatively small city with military industrial facilities. If they would have dropped these on like Kyoto or Tokyo, you're talking like 1 million people dead in an instant in Tokyo. You're talking like 850,000 people dead in 1 instant in Kyoto, right? You drop one of these over London or Paris or New York, right? I mean, instantaneously, millions would be dead. So again, we say surrender. They say no. August 9th, you have the Bockscar dropping Fat Man on the city of Nagasaki. And once again, in a flash, 60,000 people die in a flash. Thousands more die from radiation, from burns, from injuries from this. Again, you can see the before and the after. Here you can see like some type of sports complex, right? You can just see the outline of like the track, right? Right. Look at like all these, all these buildings up here, right? They're just gone. It's like you can kind of see the concrete and the pavement, but otherwise everything's gone. Eventually, over 250,000 people die from the 2 blasts. So about 250,000 people die from the 2 blasts. Now, after August 9th, again, the United States says surrender. Believe it or not, the military leaders of Japan wanted to keep fighting. And in about a week or two, the United States would have had another bomb ready. It wasn't fully assembled, it wasn't ready to go yet, but we had the parts making their way towards Japan. So we could have had another bomb ready to go in probably about 10 to 14 days to drop on Japan, and we just would have gone down the list, going larger and larger in the targets and the amount of people that it would target. So eventually the Japanese would surrender. Within about 2 months, we probably could have had about 12 more bombs after the initial 3. The military leaders wanted to keep fighting, but the emperor didn't. And eventually what he had to do, he had to secretly record himself on a record announcing the Japanese surrender, and then have one of the cooks from his kitchen sneak it out of the imperial palace, get it to a radio station, have the radio station play it, and then the radio station get a copy to the Allied forces. And that's how Japan surrendered. Right? It still took a couple days. So it was August 14th. That's what we call VJ Day. Victory in Japan Day, August 14th, 1945. Victory in Europe Day, when the Germans surrendered, was May 8th of 1945. If you've ever seen the picture of the sailor walking up to a woman and kissing her in the streets of New York, that's VE Day, Victory in Europe Day, May 8th, 1945. VJ Day, Victory in Japan Day, August 15th, 1945. It'll be a little bit later on September 2nd that Japan formally surrenders to General Douglas MacArthur on board the USS Missouri off the coast of Japan. Actually, Emperor Hirohito was allowed to stay in power as in title only. He was what's called a titular ruler, where you are a powerless head of state, because he really wasn't in charge of what was going on, was relatively naive and deceived by Emperor Tojo and a lot of his military advisors and leaders. But the Japanese surrender after the dropping of these 2 atomic bombs, but the course of world history has changed forever. We're going to go into a period of world history after this known as the Cold War, where for a while the United States had a nuclear monopoly. We were the only country around that had nuclear weapons. Eventually the Soviets will be able to steal some nuclear secrets from the United States and have some good science and build their own nuclear weapons. And then there'll be this nuclear arms race from the 1950s into the 1980s that we call the Cold War, where basically the Soviet Union and the United States are arm wrestling each other for who's more powerful, who has more influence around the world, and who's going to build the bigger nuclear arsenal to be able to assure the destruction of the other one. Eventually we got to a point where it was mutually assured destruction. If one thing would have gone wrong from about 1972 on to the end of the Cold War, which is around 1989, right? From about 1972 to 1989, one thing goes wrong and a little war breaks out between the United States and the Soviet Union, and it's mutually assured destruction where basically everyone would have died. It would have been nuclear holocaust. But the course of world history has changed forever. The war is over, which, everyone can, raise a glass to and celebrate. But we enter into a new period of history after this, the period of nuclear armament, which we're still in today. So when we come back on Monday, we'll take a look at the war's legacy and the wartime conferences and diplomacy that were going on that the United States were part of. Great job this week. Make sure to hop over to the quizzes. It's a nice, super easy 2-question quiz that hopefully will be a grade booster for you. And I'll see you next time, ladies. Great job. Adios.